In Granite City, Illinois, you can buy a house for less than most people's student loans. In Youngstown, Ohio, homes sell for what a used car costs. Most people see these prices and think they found the American dream on clearance. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand why entire cities are practically giving away real estate and what that reveals about where the economy is headed, subscribe. Because what looks like opportunity is actually a 50-year economic collapse playing out in slow motion. And that's what we're breaking down today. These aren't deals, they're warnings. Across the American Rust Belt, cities that once powered the nation's manufacturing engine have lost 40 to 65% of their population since 1970. When factories closed, incomes collapsed by 20 to 30%. Property values evaporated. Tax bases disappeared. What you're seeing isn't affordable housing. It's the aftermath of deindustrialization. Today, we're counting down 10 U.S. towns where home prices have dropped so low, you'll question everything you thought you knew about real estate value. By the end, you'll see the pattern most Americans miss, the real cost of cheap housing. From Midwest factory towns to former steel capitals, these places tell the story of what happens when an economic system moves faster than the people living inside it. Between 1970 and 2010, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh each lost more than 40% of their residents. Manufacturing disappeared offshore. Workers followed the jobs south or simply gave up. Median household incomes in places like Cleveland fell 30% in real purchasing power. When that many people leave that quickly, housing doesn't just get cheaper, it becomes almost worthless. This channel exists to track these shifts, to follow the economic decisions that reshape entire communities, and to explain what those patterns mean for the rest of us before the headlines catch up. Number 10. Garfield Heights, Ohio. Median home price, $140,000. A Cleveland suburb where houses cost less than a year's salary. 20 minutes from downtown, tree-lined streets, modest homes with for sale signs that stay up for months. Garfield Heights sits in the orbit of a city that's been contracting for half a century. Cleveland lost 45% of its population since 1970. The region's median income dropped 30% in real terms over the same period. Northeast Ohio's population decline has slowed but never stopped. Homes here sell for 66% below the national median. You could buy a 3-bedroom house for what a used SUV costs in Los Angeles. Garfield Heights shows what happens to suburbs when the city they depend on collapses. When Cleveland lost 14% of its population in just the 2000s, places like Garfield Heights felt every departure. Property taxes rise to compensate for fewer residents. Schools consolidate, services shrink. The homes are cheap because the system around them is failing. Imagine neighborhoods where every third house has been empty for years, where local governments raise taxes on remaining residents just to keep the lights on, where young families leave because they see no future. Could you raise children in a place still processing decades of decline? Number 9. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Median home price, $249,000. Steel City lost 40% of its population but kept more of its income than its neighbors. Three rivers meet where America's steel industry once dominated the world. Pittsburgh lost the same percentage of residents as Cleveland and Detroit, but median income only fell 10%. That's the difference between total collapse and managed decline. Universities replaced factories. Hospitals absorbed laid-off steel workers. The city transitioned from making things to educating people and treating the sick. Home prices remain 40% below the national median, but unlike Gary or Youngstown, Pittsburgh stabilized. It's still shrinking, still among 16 major U.S. cities that lost population in the 2010s, but it's not hemorrhaging. Pittsburgh is what happens when a city loses its defining industry but keeps its institutions. The neighborhoods built for steelworkers now house grad students and nurses. Homes that once sold for triple their current value sit on the market, affordable but undesirable. Picture entire blocks of pre-war houses selling for what coastal residents spend on a down payment. Beautiful architecture in a city that can't escape its past. Is $249,000 worth living somewhere still defined by what it used to be? Number 8. Birmingham, Alabama. Median home price, $148,950. The Pittsburgh of the South, where steel mills shaped identity and affordability, now defines opportunity. Birmingham ranks as the fourth best market for first-time buyers in 2026. Not because it's thriving, but because it's cheap. The city's industrial base collapsed like its northern counterparts, just with better weather and slower decline. Young buyers are cautiously exploring what older generations abandoned. Homes cost 64% below the national median. Universities and hospitals provide some stability, unlike purely industrial towns where every job disappeared at once. You could buy a Birmingham house with what most people spend on rent in a year. Southern industrial cities face the same pressures as Rust Belt towns, just stretched over longer timelines. The decline is gentler, but no less real. Historic homes built for factory managers now sell for what entry-level workers earn annually. Birmingham proves that deindustrialization wasn't just a northern problem, it was an American reckoning that hit everywhere manufacturing mattered. Would you move somewhere affordable precisely because it reflects economic uncertainty? Number 7. Syracuse, New York. Median home price, $169,900. Upstate New York's manufacturing relic, where homes are cheap, but prices are finally climbing. Syracuse sits in that uncomfortable middle zone between Rust Belt decay and tentative recovery. The city is forecasting 12.4% price growth in 2026, the highest among comparable markets. Still 59% below the national median, but moving in the right direction for the first time in decades. Population has stabilized after years of bleeding residents. Syracuse University anchors an economy that used to run on factories. The college stayed when everything else left. Syracuse represents what recovery looks like 40 years after the collapse. Homes under $170,000 in a city that might actually see appreciation. It's not a boom, it's barely a pulse, but compared to Toledo or Gary, it's a miracle. Cities with major universities can stabilize even after manufacturing evaporates. They just never fully recover their former position. Imagine buying a house for under $170K, knowing it might actually gain value, a bet on slow healing rather than continued decline. Would you invest in a city showing its first signs of life after decades of economic trauma? Number 6. Toledo, Ohio. Median home price, under $100,000. More than half of all Toledo homes, 52.34%, sell for under 6 figures. Glass City, Auto Parts Hub, Lake Erie Port. Toledo has the infrastructure of a once-thriving industrial center and the empty factories to prove it. Among only 4 U.S. cities that sustained population losses even during the 2010 growth period when most places stabilized. Toledo lost residents every single year of that decade. Manufacturing decline continues. Regional income remains significantly below national average. You could buy multiple investment properties for what one bedroom costs in San Francisco, but there's no one to rent to. Toledo represents the middle tier of Rust Belt decline. Not as catastrophic as Detroit, but nowhere near recovery. Driving through neighborhoods where every other house is abandoned or selling for less than a new pickup truck. The city can't attract new residents because there's no economic reason to come. Factories that once employed thousands now sit gutted and empty, too expensive to demolish, too worthless to renovate. Could you see opportunity in a city where houses cost less than most people's emergency fund? If you're still watching, you already understand what most people miss. These aren't just cheap houses, they're economic graveyards. The top 5 make this impossible to ignore. These are places where the collapse was so complete the housing market may never recover. Subscribe if understanding these patterns matters to you, and like this video so it reaches people who still think cheap real estate is always a good deal. Number 5. Rochester, New York. Median home price, $139,900. The number 1 market for first-time buyers in 2026. Not because it's booming, but because it's affordable. Kodak's former empire. Rochester is what happens when one company's collapse drags an entire region down. But unlike other Rust Belt cities, Rochester kept its institutions. Universities, hospitals, corporate headquarters stayed even as Kodak withered. 42% of homes list under $100,000. The median income for 25 to 34-year-olds is $48,670. Price-to-income ratio of 2.9, the most favorable in America. Shortest average commute at 21 minutes. The city even offers $8,000 grants to first-time buyers. Rochester ranks first because young people can actually afford to live there. Kodak employed 60,000 people at its peak. Now it's gone, and the city rebuilt around what remained. 5.3% forecasted sales growth in 2026, the strongest in its category. Rochester diversified before complete collapse, which is why it's affordable instead of abandoned. Entire neighborhoods of well-maintained homes, decent schools, short commutes, all selling for less than a down payment in Boston. Not because they're undesirable, but because the jobs that made them valuable left 30 years ago. Would you move to America's most affordable market, knowing the boom times are never returning? Number 4. Cleveland, Ohio. Median home price, under $100,000 for 44% of all homes. Cleveland lost 65% of its peak population. In 1950, 1.85 million people called this city home. Today, barely 370,000 remain. Lake Erie shoreline, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an empty neighborhood stretching for miles. Between 1970 and 2006, Cleveland lost 45% of its residents. Median household income fell 30% in real dollars. Even as decline slowed, the city continues shrinking, 2.74% loss between 2020 and 2023. Some neighborhoods lost more than half their housing units between 1970 and 2010. Not just people leaving, entire houses demolished because no one wanted them. The interesting part? Middle-income neighborhoods saw the steepest decline. Wealthy areas contracted inward, poor areas stayed poor, but the middle evaporated completely. You can buy a Cleveland house for less than what most Americans owe on their cars. Not because houses are worthless, but because demand collapsed with population. Cleveland exemplifies the self-reinforcing cycle. Industrial jobs disappear, people leave, property values fall, tax revenues shrink, city services deteriorate, more people leave. Neighborhoods where you could buy an entire block for what one condo costs in Denver exist because entire blocks are abandoned and the city considers bulldozing them. Could you build wealth in a place that's been contracting for 50 consecutive years? Number 3. Gary, Indiana. Median home price, $66,100. 77% of all homes sell for under $100,000. Gary lost 22% of its population in the 2000s alone. U.S. Steel's company town, Michael Jackson's birthplace, post-apocalyptic warning. Gary is what happens when a city built for 200,000 people suddenly houses only 70,000. The decline happened faster than Detroit's. When the mills closed, everything died with them. Median household income, $31,936, among the lowest in America. Unemployment near 50% in the hardest-hit neighborhoods. Vacancy rates so high, entire blocks are abandoned. Thieves strip copper and metal from vacant houses while neighbors watch helplessly, unable to stop it because there's no police budget. Gary shows what happens when a city built for 200,000 people suddenly houses only 70,000. The city was literally built by and for one company. When U.S. Steel reduced operations, there was no backup plan, no diversified economy, no other employers to absorb workers. Houses don't just lose value in Gary, they become liabilities. Property taxes on a worthless asset, maintenance on something no one will ever buy. Residents park cars in abandoned driveways next door just to make houses look occupied. The city debates demolishing entire sections because there's no tax base to maintain infrastructure for neighborhoods where more houses are empty than full. At what price does a house stop being an asset and start being a burden? Number 2. Detroit, Michigan. Median home price, $65,000 to $75,000. Motor City lost 65% of its peak population and became the largest American city to declare bankruptcy. Assembly lines, Motown, suburban sprawl. 185 million people in 1950, 630,000 today. Entire neighborhoods stand empty. City services contracted to a fraction of their former reach. Detroit lost another 25.7% of its population in just the 2000s. Since 2010, 43,000 more residents left, the most of any U.S. city. Median income fell 30% in real terms between 1970 and 2006. The city filed bankruptcy in 2013. Over 70,000 abandoned structures dot the landscape. Detroit is where the American dream didn't fade, it physically crumbled house by house, block by block. The collapse is the Rust Belt story taken to its logical extreme: automation, globalization, and suburbanization, all converging on a single city that never diversified beyond auto manufacturing. A city built for 2 million people housing 630,000. Neighborhoods reclaimed by nature, homes selling for $1 with no buyers. Firefighters letting vacant houses burn because there's no budget to save them. Detroit represents permanent decline, the endpoint of what happens when economic forces overwhelm a city's ability to adapt. Every policy failure, every short-sighted decision, every moment of hoping things would return to normal instead of planning for a different future, all visible in abandoned buildings stretching to the horizon. Would you bet on Detroit's comeback, or is this what the end looks like? Number 1. Youngstown, Ohio. Median home price $44,800. 90% of all homes valued under $100,000. The cheapest housing market in America, where you can buy a home for less than a year at minimum wage. Steel Valley, factory town, economic dead zone. Black Monday, September 19, 1977. Youngstown sheet and tube closed. 5,000 workers lost their jobs in a single day. More mills followed within months. The city never recovered. Median household income, $28,822, second lowest in the nation. Population lost 18.9% in the 2000s and continues declining. 1 in 3 homes vacant in the hardest-hit neighborhoods. You can qualify for a mortgage in Youngstown with an annual income of just $15,014. You can buy a house for what most people spend on vacation, and it still might not be a good investment. Youngstown represents the endpoint of deindustrialization, where housing is essentially free but nobody wants it. When 20 factories close and never reopen, when entire industrial valleys are torn down, when residents head back south because there's nothing left, housing prices don't just fall, they collapse to near zero. Neighborhoods where every third house is empty and crumbling. People pull cars into abandoned driveways to fake occupancy. Thieves strip everything metal from vacant homes. The median house costs less than a used Honda Civic and still sits on the market for months because there are no jobs, no services, no reason to stay. At $44,800, would you take the risk, or does Youngstown prove some prices are low for a reason? From Youngstown's $44,000 homes to Rochester's stabilizing market, these aren't random anomalies. They're the result of economic forces that reshaped America. Offshoring, automation, white flight, tax-based collapse, population decline that became self-reinforcing. Whether places are giving away houses or preparing for comebacks, they're all responding to systems that changed faster than cities could adapt. And in 2026, half of U.S. homes are losing value, meaning what happened here might be coming to you. If this changed how you see cheap real estate, if you now understand price alone never tells the full story, subscribe. Every week we break down economic patterns most people don't notice until they're personally affected. The places, the policies, the decisions that shape where we live and how we build wealth. Because understanding why Youngstown homes cost $44,000 matters more than knowing where to find a bargain.